In my today's interview with Dr. Menna Demessie, we are going to discuss the racial inequalities and police violence in America. Dr. Menna is a vice president of policy analysis and research at the Black Caucus Foundation, and she is an adjunct professor at the University of California at the Washington Center. Please stay with us. All right, Dr. Menna, welcome to the Gera-show, and thanks for taking your time to be on this program within a short notice. How are you these days? Within the last 78 plus hours, there was a lot going on in this country, and how are you feeling?
Yeah, thank you for asking. It's been very difficult. It's a moment for reflection. For our country, for our brothers and sisters. It's not easy when we see the repetition of the death of Black people unjustifiably. So, as I watched the news and I participated in a vigil this morning for George Floyd, the nation is mourning, but the nation is also very frustrated. So I'm trying to stay strong, but it is becoming increasingly difficult, because so many of us are invested and have been invested in the fight for justice and freedom. And so to have that taken away from the police, the law enforcement that's actually supposed to protect our rights, is very disconcerting and difficult to deal with.
That's true, that's true. Dr. Menna, you were born and raised in a foreign house here in America. And tell us about it. How do you see racism here in this country? What does racism mean for you?
So yes, I was born in Cleveland, Ohio, which is where I'm reaching out to you right now, and take pride in having always had one foot in the American culture as a proud American, but also another in the land of my parents, home country, Ethiopia. And so for myself and many other children of immigrants, we are hyphenated Americans in the United States, which simply means that we contribute to the melting pot of America. We bring our culture and our parents' history with us in defining who we are in this country. So when you think about us as Black immigrants, or Ethiopian immigrants in particular, or the children and descendants of Ethiopian immigrants, we come to this country with a very strong sense of who we are. At the same time, many immigrants also are quickly confronted with the reality of race in America, which is a social construct by which people are classified by race. And it's been that way before even the Declaration of Independence. We were, as Black people, not seen as real human beings. And we have proof of that. We have a history that has shown us how we've also come out of that in many ways. But at the same time, we know the lingering effects of post-slavery is the manifestation of covert racism and the continuation of marginalization of people based on race. It's the combination of class and power and white supremacy. We see racism in macro ways as institutions continue to disproportionately affect communities, and we see this with data. But we also see it at a micro level with videos of killings and murders that are happening right in our face because someone is Black. And so, of course, it's racism, but I think the more important question is, what is racism? And for many people, it actually means death. Racism is death. either alive or after death. When we're alive, we are dealing with the chipping away at our soul, at our mental well-being, at our opportunity for education and employment. And for many of us, when it comes to the criminal justice system, particularly for Black men, but also for Black women, racism equates death, unjustifiable death, and we need to really wrap our heads around that.
Yep, that is true. Let me ask you this, Dr. Menna, as a Black person, how George Floyd's death affected you personally?
It's very difficult. It's emotional. When I really took me a while to actually watch the video. We get so desensitized by seeing, videos of violence and murder, and it's not necessary to watch it. But I did, hear sort of his voice of screaming for his mother, calling out he can't breathe. It reminded me of Eric Garner, who said 11 times he couldn't breathe. The pleading of life by law enforcement is really hard to grasp. So for me, I'm emotional. I cry when I hear the struggles and the screams of helplessness and fear. I'm also very angry. I'm enraged at white rage that continues to wreak havoc, harm, and murder on Black and brown people and Black and brown bodies. It's very taxing because in our history as Black people, we have been exposed and the victims of constant violence by institutions, by people, by law enforcement, and by the President of the United States. And to have to keep, a strong head on your shoulders and have to not be emotional and to just sort of go along and keep it together, it's not only unrealistic, it's unfair, especially when so many of us are engaging and have engaged in non-violent civil disobedience. We keep getting met by violent disobedience, by white supremacists, by racists, by law enforcement. And so to some point, you kind of wonder, like, am I crazy? Because we're forgiving people and we've forgiven, just like the Black men and women in the church in Charleston, South Carolina, forgave the young white man who went to service with them and then pulled out a gun and shot 9 people, and they forgave him while he smirked in the courtroom, and it was not forgiving, right? So many parents and families and spouses of murdered victims in Black communities constantly forgive. We're a very forgiving people. And so for us to be frustrated in this moment is justifiable. It's necessary. We cannot take this any longer. And frankly, I don't think society or the world would even be listening to us if we weren't angry. That's what you're witnessing right now. You're witnessing people who held it together for years, days on end, hoping, praying, working their entire lives for a better system that would treat people fairly. And it continues to fail us at every waking moment. So it's very difficult to stay sane, to continue with business as usual. It demands us to do more and to be unapologetic about it. And really, I mean, we are being victims of Black genocide. And one has to ask, do you just keep forgiving people while they massacre your people? Or do you actually take up your rights to defend yourself? Because that's where we are. We've been relying on a broken law enforcement system to protect us, but they're actually the main perpetrators of the crime.
It's very interesting. I'll tell you a little story. I was taking the other day my daughter to job training, and every time when she saw a police officer on the street, and she was telling me that, "Oh, Daddy, be careful. There's a police out there. Be careful." And it's just, it's very sad. How long are we going to continue with this kind of fear and inequalities, in this country? And it's very unusual time that we have right now, and It's sad, and many people think that racism ended in this country right after the civil rights movements, but still racism exists. It's just we see all kind of this horrible act by the police officers to the black people, and it's very, very touching, and it's traumatizing everyone.
I appreciate you sharing that story. I have been talking to friends and thinking about my own experiences living in a predominantly white suburb outside of Cleveland, with my parents being the only black people on their street. So definitely the only Ethiopians on their street. My dad is a runner in addition to being an engineer, and we're always in constant, we grew up always with a constant fear of him, more than us, being subject to racism. I've witnessed it since I was young. We all have our stories, but sometimes I hesitate to share them because then people box that in and say, oh, that's racism right there, and then maybe not this thing. But racism shows up in many different forms. The most obvious ones are the ones that are most overt and most sort of violent in your face, like we witnessed with George Floyd or Mike Brown or Trayvon Martin or Tamir Rice or Laquan McDonald or Jordan Davis. Or Sandra Bland or Breonna Taylor. The list just keeps going on and on. But in my own family, my dad, we're in constant fear of him even jogging. He goes running 9-10 miles every other day. A truck had attempted to run him over maybe 5-10 years ago. All kinds of things have happened, even to myself. I've been pulled over by the police and searched in Indiana for no reason at all. I was actually a bridesmaid in a wedding in a car driving 3 other bridesmaids way under the speed limit in Indiana, and was followed for 2-3 miles by a police cop. I didn't know it was so dark outside, and I showed my license, and I tried to pull out all the cards I could. Oh, I'm a PhD student and da da da. That stuff doesn't matter. I'm a black person to the cops. They had me get out the car, take a breathalyzer test. It was very scary. In Maryland, I was pulled over by a police officer and had to go to trial because the police officer lied. My mom was a witness in the car, and he filed a complaint against me saying I was driving without a license. So how did I leave the scene if I didn't have a license? I wouldn't have been able to go anywhere. It was a complete lie. And luckily I, won the trial. But these are very small examples in my own world, but we're in constant fear of something more violent happening, and you have to avoid certain places. My dad has raised both my brother and I to be very conscious of our surroundings. It's a skill to avoid white rage and to be a victim of white rage. And a lot of white people don't understand that because they don't live it. So for them, it has to be sort of someone calling you the N-word in your face, these like old school ideas of how racism works. And that's not how it works. There's millions of instances where we're constantly living with the fear of being the victim of racism, whether it's being kicked out of a classroom unfairly, torn to the ground by police officer there was a young black woman who was subject to being yanked out of her chair for what was allegedly bad behavior, but a white male officer took her to the ground. If that was your daughter, what would you do? Again, it's being perpetrated by law enforcement. So something has to change, and everyone needs to internalize these issues. We are human beings. Black people are human beings. So, I don't want to hear anyone talking about looting buildings. Of course, we don't think that's the right thing, but you have to understand what we're witnessing right now is the collective outrage of millions of black, brown, even white folks that have joined the cause. It's collective outrage against white supremacy. And when white supremacy continues to rear its ugly head and murder black people unjustifiably, what are we supposed to do? What are we supposed to do? That's the question. People are frustrated and they want change. And thank God they're making a lot of noise about it, because now they have the attention of the country.
Absolutely. This is not anymore a community or a neighborhood issue. This is now huge. And I'm sure we're going to come out of this thing very, very strongly, and every time I see that video, I cry. It's sad, I mean, what if somebody also there, if it was not George Floyd, and if someone says, a white person or another person saying, I can't breathe, guess what? To begin with, you don't even get on the ground, okay? They all call him an ambulance or helicopter and take him to the nearest hospital immediately. But when George Floyd said, I can't breathe, they gave him a knee. That's very, very disturbing, and we just don't know. Our children, they don't know whether we're gonna come back home after work or when we go out, and we don't even know if our children are going to be safe out there, and come home from school with all this brutalities going on out there. And as you know, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, more people of color getting sick and dying, and more minorities are losing their jobs at a faster rate. On top of all this, the police brutality towards people of color is getting out of control. What's your take on this issue as a researcher and a policy analyst?
Congressional Black Caucus Foundation, where I serve as Vice President of Policy Analysis and Research, as well as the Leadership Institute. On April 16th, we kicked off a series of 6 virtual brain trusts on key issues affecting the Black community in the context of COVID-19. And it's been overwhelmingly challenging, because most of us who do this work understand what the research tells us, which is that there are statistically significant disparities between Black folks and pretty much any other race. I mean, Hispanics tend to be a little bit closer in terms of the similar circumstances, but in comparison to the white community, Black people continue to suffer, whether we're talking about wealth, where the racial wealth gap, you have white wealth is 13 times higher than Black. If you're talking about the unemployment rate, the Black unemployment rate is twice as high as the white unemployment rate. If you're talking about the census, that is the decennial census that pretty much is a census count of the U.S. population and determines the allocation of billions of federal dollars for major social services and programs. We see, again, a massive undercount of the Black and Hispanic population. And yet now with COVID, all of those statistics get exacerbated. The same is true with public health. I mean, you have disproportionate lack of access to equitable health care, to access to Medicaid for low-income Americans. Even with the advantages of the Affordable Care Act, or at least the improvements upon previous law with regard to access to health care, the ACA has been an improvement, but there are still disparities there, even in accessing the insurance exchange and making sure you're making a good choice about what healthcare provider you want to choose. So in the midst of all of that, you now have a global pandemic that is life-threatening, that will continue to disproportionately affect the most vulnerable communities. And that does include the white working poor or the white poor. But, in terms of numbers and percentages, we're really looking at a significant portion of minority communities of color. And that is scary. It's scary because, first of all, just at the level of education or understanding the where we are in terms of the statistics on this knowing if there's a stay-at-home order, or more importantly, knowing where to go if you need resources, the most vulnerable communities have an information gap. When we're talking about the census, for instance, this will be the first time the census allows respondents to fill out the census online. Well, that's great for people who have access to the internet, but there are millions of people that don't. And so what is that going to look like for those communities that many of whom are, minority communities? And then, of course, we have a general election in November, which will be the first election without the full protections of the Voting Rights Act. And for the people who are the victims of police brutality, of racism and discrimination, of brutal words and policies that are set out by President Trump, this election is critical. But when we talk about turnout for the elections, we also know that restrictive voting rights, the requirement to show multiple IDs, the cutting off of early voting days, these things, voter purging, these things are done in a sophisticated way based on race, and the courts have outruled them in many cases, like in Texas, for instance, where at one point the state of Texas allowed members of the NRA to use their gun license as a form of ID, but students in colleges in Texas couldn't use their college ID. And that seems so irrational. It's so intentional. It's done because we know young people tend to, vote on the left in many cases more than they do on the right, and that was ruled out of the court. And those were similar cases that took place in North Carolina, and so it's very scary right now. Shelby versus Holder, the gutting of the Voting Rights Act is really scary, because at one point we had a federal clearance requirement for southern states that participated in the construction of unfair election practices, and they had to get federal pre-clearance. And these are southern states, for the most part, that have had a history of discriminating against Black people, and that requirement has been gutted from the Voting Rights Act. So you have a number of elected officials that are trying to turn this around very quickly. And, a lot of civil rights and voting rights organizations like the Brennan Center in New York City, going around state by state to make sure that we are prepared to come out in strong numbers. But the reality is, again, in a global pandemic, you have to really ask yourself, who's really going to be out there? Who's going to show up? We have extended the deadline for the census to October 31st. Should we do the same with the election? We have to, be mindful of making sure that everyone has a fair chance to vote while also staying safe.
Completely agree, Dr. Menna. As you know, due to limited hours that we have to wrap up our program. And I know you two had a very long day. But before we do that, what can you say or advise to the Black immigrant communities about racism and police violence in America?
Yes. So very briefly, I, as a proud Ethiopian American, really strongly urge my Ethiopian brothers and sisters, my African brothers and sisters, to understand that our struggle and African American struggle is the same struggle. We cannot be successful in this country if we don't have a Pan-African approach to the work that we do. It is on the backs of African Americans from the, slavery, the abolishment of slavery, and the passage of the Civil War amendments, namely the 14th Amendment of the United States, that gives due process under the law, that conceived of the notion of citizenship, because Black people were considered 3/5 human, and before that they were considered chattel slavery. And if those Black enslaved African Americans didn't do the work that they did for us, Africans and Ethiopians would not even be in the United States. So we need to stand up and know that nobody, when a police officer pulls you over, they're not asking what your ethnic background is. They don't give a crap. If they see you and you're Black, you are a target. Our struggles are the same, and we need to stand up wherever injustice occurs, not only with respect to Ethiopians and what's happening in Ethiopia, but what's happening to our community right here in the United States. We are the largest incarceration population. The United States is 5% of the world's population and 25% of the prison population. And every Black male, at least 1 in 3, will experience the criminal justice system in their lifetime. And that includes Ethiopians, and that includes Africans, and that includes Nigerians. So, we need to be together, but really we need to be together because our struggle is the same and we're stronger together. So, educate yourself, be part of the movement. Don't take pride in segregating yourself. Being a strong Ethiopian means that you can reach out to your brother and sister no matter where they're from and understand that together you can make a difference.
I agree on that. Thank you so much, Dr. Menna, and it's always a great honor to have you on the Gera-show, and I hope to have you back in the future with a different topic. And thank you for tonight, Dr. Menna.